The chamber beneath the palace of Nineveh smelled of cedar oil and fear, not the sharp animal fear of soldiers facing death in battle, but something slower, colder, more complete. The kind of fear that comes from understanding that everything you were has ended, that your name will be erased, that your body will become property, that the gods you prayed to cannot reach you in this place, carved into bedrock beneath the greatest city in the world. The walls were covered in carved reliefs. Even in the dim lamplight, you could see what they depicted. Kings of Assyria receiving tribute from conquered peoples, cities burning, prisoners being impaled on stakes, and everywhere, woven through these scenes of conquest, images of women, kneeling, veiled, hands bound, queens stripped of crowns, princesses torn from palaces, royal daughters transformed into possessions, catalogued in clay tablets alongside gold and ivory and livestock. In the center of the chamber stood a stone basin filled with water that caught the lamplight and threw dancing reflections across the ceiling. The water was not for drinking. It was not for washing in any ordinary sense. This was ritual purification, the process by which a woman who had been a queen, who had commanded servants and issued decrees and worn the symbols of divine authority, would be transformed into something else entirely. The Assyrians had a word for it in their administrative tablets: property of the palace, 3 words that erased lineage and identity and everything that came before. Beside the basin stood a eunuch named Nabu Shumidina. He was perhaps 40 years old, though his smooth face made age difficult to determine. He had been castrated as a boy after his own city fell to Assyrian conquest, raised in the palace to serve in the royal household, trained to oversee the Bit Ashirti, the women's quarters, where captured queens and foreign princesses and the daughters of vassal kings lived out their remaining years in silence and shadow. He had witnessed this transformation ceremony dozens of times, but tonight was different. Tonight, the woman being prepared was not some minor princess from a small kingdom that no one would remember in 10 years. Tonight, it was the Queen of Elam herself. She stood before the basin wearing the remains of her royal clothing, though the crown and jewels had already been stripped away. Her name was inscribed in cuneiform on a clay tablet that lay on a wooden table beside the basin. Tomorrow that tablet would be dissolved in water, the clay returning to formless mud, her original name disappearing as though it had never existed. She would be given a new name, Belti Eli, Lady of the Gods, a generic title that could apply to any woman that carried no memory of her homeland or her lineage or the royal house she had been born into. What would happen to her over the following hours, the ritual that would mark her transition from queen to possession, was never recorded in full in Assyrian administrative texts. The scribes who documented everything else in meticulous detail, who counted jars of oil and recorded the names of horses and tracked tribute payments from distant provinces, maintained careful silence about the specifics of these transformation ceremonies. Later, sources hint at practices that violated not just the dignity of the women involved, but every principle of sacred kingship that ancient Near Eastern cultures claimed to honor. But the details remained deliberately obscured, recorded only in fragments, whispered about by servants who had witnessed things they could not fully describe, preserved in the archaeological record through absences and silences that historians struggle to interpret. What we know is that these ceremonies happened regularly in the underground chambers of Assyrian palaces, that they were conducted by eunuchs under the authority of the king, that they involved water and oil and incense and ritual formulas recited in Akkadian, that women who entered those chambers as queens emerged as nameless property whose lives would never again be their own, and that the psychological and physical transformation was so complete that captured queens who had once commanded armies and negotiated treaties and ruled kingdoms became silent shadows who moved through palace corridors without protesting, without showing any sign of the persons they had been before Assyrian conquest destroyed their worlds. The Assyrians who designed this system understood something that most ancient conquerors did not consciously recognize. Killing a defeated king created martyrs and resistance. Executing royal families turned them into symbols that could inspire rebellion. But transforming queens into anonymous possessions, erasing their identities, making them serve the very gods whose temples their husbands had once protected. This was degradation so complete that it destroyed not just individuals, but the legitimacy of entire dynasties. When a queen disappeared into the Assyrian palace system and never emerged, when she was renamed and put to work grinding grain for temple offerings, or serving wine at royal banquets, or performing tasks that reduced her to the level of the lowliest slave, it demonstrated that the gods themselves had abandoned her, that her previous royal status had been illegitimate, that Assyrian conquest was not just military victory, but divine judgment. Tonight, as Nabu-shum-iddina watched the Elamite queen standing before the purification basin, as he prepared to begin the ritual that would erase who she had been, he felt something he had not felt during previous ceremonies. Pity mixed with something darker. Recognition that what he was about to facilitate went beyond necessity or strategy into territory that his own gods might judge harshly when his turn came to face their judgment. But he was a eunuch in the service of the greatest king in the world. He had no choice, and she had no choice. And what happened next would be recorded only in the memories of those present, in the silent testimony of archaeological remains discovered 27 centuries later, in the gaps and absences in Assyrian royal inscriptions that boasted about every other aspect of conquest but maintained careful silence about the specific fates of captured queens. But before I tell you exactly what happened in that chamber beneath Nineveh, before I reveal what transformation rituals actually involved and why Assyrian scribes refused to document them in full, before I explain what archaeological evidence tells us about the fates of women who disappeared into the palace system and never emerged, I need to take you back. I need to show you who the Assyrians were, how they built an empire that terrorized the ancient Near East for 3 centuries, what they did to the kingdoms they conquered, and why the treatment of captured queens became central to their entire system of domination. If you want to understand how systematic cruelty can be rationalized as religious duty, how intelligent people can design institutions that destroy human dignity while claiming divine sanction, how entire systems can be built around the erasure and control of women whose only crime was being born into royal families that stood in the way of Assyrian expansion, then you need to watch this entire video. Subscribe right now, because what you are about to learn exists in the archaeological record and in fragmentary texts and in silences that speak louder than words. Hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling me what you know about ancient Assyria, because I guarantee this story goes deeper and darker than anything you learned in school. And watch all the way to the end, because I am going to tell you what happened when Nineveh finally fell, how the tables turned, how Assyrian royal women experienced the same fate they had inflicted on others, how revenge was extracted for 3 centuries of systematic cruelty. Now, let me take you back to the beginning to understand how a kingdom in northern Mesopotamia became the most feared empire the ancient world had ever seen. The Assyrian Empire rose from the city of Ashur on the Tigris River in what is now northern Iraq. For centuries, Assyria had been a relatively minor power, overshadowed by Babylon to the south and threatened by mountain peoples to the north and east. But beginning in the 9th century before Christ, a series of extraordinarily ambitious and ruthlessly effective kings transformed Assyria into a military machine that would conquer everything from Egypt to the Persian Gulf, from the Mediterranean coast to the mountains of Iran. These kings, rulers like Ashurnasirpal II and Tiglath-Pileser III and Sennacherib and Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, built their empire through systematic terror, combined with administrative efficiency that was unprecedented in the ancient world. They did not just conquer territories, They destroyed the psychological foundations that allowed conquered peoples to imagine resistance. They created a system where submission seemed not just militarily necessary, but religiously inevitable, where the gods themselves appeared to have endorsed Assyrian dominance, where rebellions seemed not just futile, but blasphemous. The military tactics were brutal even by ancient standards. Assyrian armies practiced psychological warfare deliberately and systematically. They would besiege cities for months, slowly starving populations while building siege towers and battering rams visible from the walls, letting defenders watch their doom approaching with mechanical inevitability. When cities fell, the punishment was designed to be memorable. Leaders were impaled on stakes. Populations were deported en masse to distant provinces where they would never see their homelands again. Cities were burned so thoroughly that nothing remained but ash and rubble. But the Assyrians understood that military conquest alone was insufficient for building a stable empire. They needed to destroy the legitimacy of conquered dynasties, to make clear that previous rulers had lost divine favor, that their gods had abandoned them, that resistance was not just militarily hopeless, but spiritually condemned. And this is where the treatment of captured royal families, particularly queens and princesses, became central to Assyrian imperial ideology. When Assyrian armies conquered a kingdom, they did not simply kill the royal family. That would have been simpler and, in some ways, more merciful. Instead, they took the king and queen and their children captive, transporting them to Assyria, where they would serve as living demonstrations of Assyrian superiority. The defeated king might be paraded through the streets of Nineveh in chains, forced to kneel before the Assyrian king while crowds jeered. He might be kept alive for years, displayed during royal celebrations as a trophy, reminded daily that he had lost everything, including his dignity. But what happened to captured queens was different, more systematic, more designed to destroy not just individuals, but the entire concept of legitimate opposition to Assyrian rule. These women were taken to the royal palaces, particularly the great palace complexes at Nineveh and Nimrud, where they were processed through a system that transformed them from queens into anonymous property. This system, the Bit Ashirti, or women's quarters, was one of the most sophisticated instruments of control and degradation the ancient world produced. The archaeological evidence for this system comes from multiple sources. Palace reliefs carved during the reigns of various Assyrian kings show captive women in processions, often veiled and with hands bound or positioned in gestures of submission. Administrative tablets from palace archives record lists of foreign women, carefully categorized by origin and status, and assigned specific roles within the palace household. Letters between palace officials discuss the management of these women, the punishments for disobedience, the protocols for ensuring their silence and submission. And burial evidence from palace complexes shows female skeletons wearing jewelry from multiple different regions, suggesting these were women from conquered kingdoms who died in Assyrian captivity and were buried within palace grounds. But the most revealing evidence comes from what the Assyrians chose not to record: royal inscriptions that boast an elaborate detail about military victories, about cities conquered and enemies defeated and tribute collected, maintain careful silence about what happened to captured queens after they arrived in Assyria. The scribes who documented everything else with obsessive precision simply stopped writing when it came to the specifics of how these women were processed and controlled and used. This silence is not accidental. It suggests that what happened in those palace chambers was considered either too sacred to record or too shameful to admit, even by Assyrian standards that accepted brutality as normal policy. Modern historians and archaeologists have pieced together the outlines of the system from fragments. Captured queens were taken to underground chambers in the palace complex. These chambers, carved into bedrock and accessible only through guarded passages, served as transformation spaces where women who had been royalty would be systematically broken down and rebuilt as palace property. The process involved multiple stages, each designed to remove another layer of their previous identity and replace it with the reality of their new status. The first stage was physical. Royal clothing and jewelry were removed. Hair might be cut or reshaped according to Assyrian rather than foreign custom. Bodies were washed in ritual basins using water mixed with oils and substances, whose exact composition remains unknown, but that may have included intoxicants or other chemicals designed to disorient or sedate.